Welcome back. In this video and the next video, I'm going to be talking about field research, specifically interviews and archival research. I've done a fair amount of both of these kinds of research myself, especially archival research. And almost everything I will say, especially about interviews, there will be settings in which that advice may not be appropriate. I'm mostly used to interviewing elites, and interviews with non-elites can be very different, and so on and so forth. So my advice will partly reflect my own focus and my own experience, but you should be careful to adapt it to your own field site, your own research project, and the types of people you're interviewing and the kinds of relationships that involves. So I'm going to be saying something about going to the field or site. It could be a site in your own country or it could be a site in a foreign country. I'm going to talk about interviews and all sorts of practical advice, and then archival research. So going into the field, the main thing is to prepare. You want to do everything you can beforehand. Time at the site is precious and hard to arrange, especially if it's in a foreign country. And so you want to do everything you can to be ready when you get there, so you're not spending time in the field doing things that you could have done before you got into the field. You want to have a list of interviewees that you want to get to, a get list. You want to schedule some of these in advance, but you also want to leave some time in your schedule, because maybe you'll find that there are other people you should be interviewing and you have to have some flexibility to add them in. So again, depending on your project, maybe you want to schedule as many interviews in advance as you can, or maybe you want to leave yourself a lot of time, or maybe you don't want to schedule any in advance because you don't even know till you get in the field who you want to talk to. It can help to have a research center affiliation. They can give you resources, maybe give you an office, maybe internet access, maybe even help with housing. They may be able to help you get contacts to people you might want to interview, but there can be costs as well. Do they want you to do a lot of work for them? Present classes or something? Maybe that's something you want to do, maybe it's not. Do they have a particular political reputation that's going to affect responses or attitudes from the people that you're trying to interview? So think about those issues as well. Do you want to take one long trip or several shorter ones? Again, it depends on what you're trying to do. Maybe you want to do several trips to come at different times of the year, different times in the political cycle, different times in the economic cycle, if it's in an agrarian country or something else. Or maybe you want to take one longer trip so you can develop contacts in depth in that one period of time, rather than trying to maintain them over several shorter trips. As I said, do everything you can at home, where your internet works, you remember all your passwords, where you have access to resources and a printer and whatever else. Upload your data from the field frequently in case your computer dies or gets stolen or whatever else, right? Think about when to go, what seasons of the year, what holidays you want to hit or avoid, where it is in vacation schedules, where it is in legislative schedules, where it is in electoral schedules. If you said to me, I'm coming to Washington to do interviews with Congress and I'm coming in August, I would say, forget about it. Everybody's gone from Washington in August, everybody who can, and that's everybody in Congress. They go into recess. It's terribly hot and humid. It's a great time to go to the movies in Washington. It's a terrible time to try to do interviews with members of Congress or their staff because they're all gone. So you have to be aware of some of those issues about just the pace and schedule of life in the place or the site that you're going to interview. So talk to others who have gone to the site where you're going, especially if they've done interviews there. They can give you a lot of ideas about all sorts of practical advice about transportation or housing or whatever else. But also they may have talked to some of the specific people you want to talk to, may have some insights about them. So talk to media reporters who cover the organizations or places that you're going to or countries that you're going to. Talk to fellow graduate students who've been there. Talk to people in your foreign ministry, or in the U.S. case, the State Department. Try to talk to as many people who've been there, especially recently, who can give you an idea of how things work there. Try to fix some things ahead in your schedule, as I mentioned, but also, as I said, try to leave some flexibility. There may be new people you want to interview. There may be some kind of setbacks. that you'll have to reorient yourself a little bit. So you don't want to overbook yourself and have an inflexible schedule too much. Figure out communication technologies where you're going. If you're going to another country, that can be a challenge sometimes. Try to spend some time in the site or on the field research digesting the information. It's easy to fall into the mode of just grabbing information all the time without thinking about it, reflecting on it, and deciding how does that change how I should spend the rest of my time here or who I should interview next. Because you should be, responding to the new information you're taking in and not just grabbing all the information you can. Don't be afraid to retool if something's just not working. I'm not saying to just give up your research project at the first challenge or the first thing that doesn't seem to fit very well. Consult with if you're doing a PhD thesis, consult with your committee and so on. But also don't just, go ahead doing a project when it feels like it really isn't working or you're asking the wrong question or something of that nature. Talk to your committee, see if you can retool. David Collier, who's a well-known case study qualitative methods researcher, talks about when he went in the field to do his dissertation and he had all this funding to go and everything else. And within a few days, he quickly realized that the question he was asking either wasn't interesting or couldn't really be researched or whatever else. And he was despairing. And then he sort of woke up on the fourth day and said, you know what, I'm here. I'm going to stay here until my next flight anyway. There's all sorts of interesting things going on all around me. Let me think of what interesting questions I can do. And so he sort of retooled his project successfully. So plan the interviews, write questions that you want to ask, write follow-ups. If they answer in this way, I'll go that way. If they do this, I'll go that. You want to practice with somebody if you can, a significant other, a roommate, a fellow graduate student, have them play, a difficult person to interview in various different ways, just try things out, try their questions out, have them try out different ways that somebody might respond to those questions. Like I said, anticipate how they might answer. And if there's 3 or 4 different answers, think of what would be the follow-up for each of those answers that they give. Try to decide on the flow of the conversation. I find interviews one of the most challenging aspects of case study research, but also one of the most interesting. You always learn stuff in interviews, and you feel like you're really getting closer to the action. But it's challenging because on the one hand, you want to have a structured conversation that you want to get to the questions you want to get to. On the other hand, you want it to be kind of a conversation, which can go in different directions and loop back around and may get, stuck on this point, and then you're starting to run out of time, and then you haven't asked these questions. So I find it very hard to be sort of managing the interview in your head while still having a conversation, while taking in, what the other person is saying. So if you have a game plan going in, even if you know the conversation is going to evolve, then that can help to structure things a little bit. So there are different ways you can sort of try to structure the conversation. You can go through chronologically, what happened first, then what happened, just get the timeline, if you will. Sometimes you might organize questions by functional topics or by units in an organization. I often find it useful to start off with relatively open-ended questions, so you're not prejudging the answers or pushing them in a certain direction, and then you can try to bring it around to some more structured questions that get at the specific theories and ideas that you have. But that allows for the start to be more open-ended, where you can be confronted with ideas and evidence that you hadn't thought of, and maybe come across some new theoretical understanding. So now again, it depends on the project. Some projects it's almost more like a survey where you're asking a lot of closed-ended questions, and others are completely open-ended where you're more in an inductive mode and you're just trying to figure out the basics of what happened before you can even formulate some theories and explanations that would lead to more specific structured questions. Have a checklist of questions that you want to get to. And if you allow the conversation to go around, you may have to ask at the end, can I just give you a minute so I can read through and see if there's any questions that I missed. Don't be shy about doing that, because often you have a specific list of questions that you want to get to, and you might have missed some if you're trying to also follow a natural flow of the conversation. Sometimes the best quote or the best insight comes as you're just about to leave. So don't be in a hurry to leave. And I've read a lot of reporters who talk about interviews, and many of them made this exact same point, that the best little nugget, the killer quote or whatever, comes at the very end. So don't be in a rush, unless they really are saying I have to get to another meeting or whatever, but try not to rush out the door. Leave a little bit of time to linger, and I'll give you some questions you can ask at the end in a minute as well. So do your homework. Take in all the information that's relevant to this person that you can from the internet, from media interviews they've already done or whatever else. Make clear that you're not going to waste their time asking things they've been asked 1,000 times before, and at the same time you won't be easily misled if they have some instrumental motive to try to put some spin on what they're saying or what the events were. So review, especially video if you can. Get video of the other person being interviewed. That can tell you a lot about their style. Ask journalists who've talked to them. Ask other people who've talked to them or know them if you can. What kind of interviewee might they be? Some people are famously difficult to interview, and others are fairly straightforward to interview. Gather whatever documents you can that bear on the event. So again, you're informed from that perspective. Use the information from your earlier interviews to help you structure questions and interactions in your later ones. So you want to think about the order in which you want to interview people. So who do we want to interview? Oftentimes I find people spend too much time and effort trying to get to the very top person in an organization or a group or whatever. And yeah, you want to interview them if you can, often. But often it's the people at the middle level or the lower level of an organization that really have a lot of information about your topic. And if you're trying to interview the foreign minister, they may have had 2 meetings, in the year about your topic, and they can barely remember anything about it because that was 2 out of 1,000 topics that they were dealing with. Whereas the working level person who is working that issue every day, they will remember those meetings in great detail every time the minister sneezed or took a phone call or anything else, because that's what they're living day to day, and that's a very important meeting for them. So, talk to those mid-level people, talk to those working level people. Don't just focus on the top of different hierarchies. The dynamics are very different if you're doing elite versus non-elite interviews. As I said, my personal experience is with elite interviews. And so, for example, I find elites, especially politicians, often they don't mind being tape recorded because they think they are good at answering questions in ways that won't get them into political trouble. They may or may not be as good as they think, but they actually are more worried about being misquoted. So they're actually happy, in my experience, to have you record the conversation often. And that's very helpful because I find it enormously hard to try to take notes as I'm also trying to conduct the interview. So I record it whenever I can. Non-elites may be nervous about being recorded, and depending on the political situation, that might put them in jeopardy. You might have to, obviously you should follow any rules at your institution for what we call in the United States Institutional Review Board, which reviews your proposal for human subjects research, which includes interviews. And so you have to be very careful about not putting anybody at risk, and sometimes taping non-elites could put them at risk, or even taping elites could put them at risk. So obviously you have to exercise judgment there and get approval for whatever you're doing. But just be aware the dynamics are obviously very different for these different kinds of people. If you can interview the same person more than once, that's often enormously helpful. I have never done an interview where I come away and I say, you know what, I got absolutely everything I wanted to get. I asked all the right questions. There's nothing left on the table there. I always come out and I say, oh, I should have asked this, and we ran out of time for that. And maybe 2 weeks later, it's like, oh, now I have this new information. I wish I could go back and talk to that person about this. So if you can follow up, whether it's by email or phone call or another full interview or whatever else it is, often that's an extremely useful opportunity because you almost never get everything you want at the first interview. Think about where to do the interview. Should you interview, again, if they're an elite, in their work setting, or maybe will they be nervous and awkward there, depending on the issues you're talking with them about? You know, in some countries or contexts, them being seen with a foreigner, you know, who you may be a graduate student, but other people may think you're working for an intelligence service, whether you are a graduate student or not. So, you know, would it be better to interview them outside of their work setting? If they're in their work setting, on the other hand, they may be able to just reach documents off the shelf if they're working in an unclassified setting, of course. But, you know, so there are a lot of different dynamics that might emerge depending on where you interview a person, and you know, it's hard to say anything general about that because there's so many different possibilities here, but just think about that, give some thought to that. Think about the order of interviews. Sometimes you'll try to build up to that one big important interview by doing the other ones first so you have all the information you need. Sometimes you might want to start with a big important one that'll give you a lot of leads, and then you can figure out who to interview and pursue other interviewees. Again, it's hard to say something general for every project. Think about their work schedule. What's their day like? What's a good time of day to interview them? If they're very busy and you try to get them in the morning, then maybe their schedule won't be blown off by other events of the day. On the other hand, they may be rushed to get to the next meeting. And so if you interview them at the end of the day and you're the last meeting of the day, they may be kind of tired, but maybe they have a little more flexibility in their schedule. Maybe they can give you a little more time. Maybe you go out for a drink or something afterwards and they say something even more revealing. Who knows, right? But just think about that. How will the time of day affect the nature of the interview? So how do we get people to be interviewed? Often, in my experience, although not always, it's easier than you might think. People like to get out their side of a story if they're public officials. They may be a little curious about what you're up to. They may want to contribute to research and to understanding. So, often they'll be willing. Sometimes they won't. So I would say, be polite and professional, but be persistent. Don't give up until they sort of clearly say no. So if they, it's hard to tell sometimes whether it's a date or an interview. Is somebody putting you off because they really are busy, or because they just don't want to talk to you and they're just trying to be, a little bit polite or something else? And so, if they say, oh, that's not a good time for me, well, when is a good time? Or I'm not sure if I want to do this. Well, here are some reasons I think it would be useful for you to do this, whatever. But so, if they say a clear firm no, there's no use in pushing it any farther. But until you get to that clear no, don't give up. And even then, if you come back and you're near the end of your project, and you might even still give them one more chance and say, I'm almost done with this, and I think it'll be better with your side of the story, and this is the last chance, right? If you're worried about making a direct approach, you might go through somebody that they know and trust, who you were a little bit closer to, that you can establish trust to, or maybe somebody you interviewed earlier, to say, oh, could you put in a good word for me with so-and-so? And let them know I'm not out to try to make people look bad. I'm just trying to figure out what happened here, right? Now, this will differ. How you approach that, who the intermediary is, will depend on if you're doing an elite interview or a non-elite interview. In either setting, you might need to establish some trust with an intermediary to get to that interview. So one way to get to elites, at least, and this is Bob Woodward's is a famous American reporter. He's one of the key reporters who broke the Watergate story, and he's had many books since where he recounts government meetings in detail as if he were in the meeting. And his technique of writing as if he were in the meeting is a little bit controversial, but there's almost never, in my experience, that he's been challenged on the facts and shown to be wrong about what was said or done in a meeting. So he's very good at getting people to talk. But one of the ways he does that is you basically say to the elite person you want to interview, I would hate to have to tell this story only from the point of view of name of your worst adversary. But if you don't talk to me, I can't tell your side of the story, and you're not going to come out looking as good. And that can, for elites and politicians, that can often be very effective, right? Okay, so for the interview itself, try to establish some rapport at the start, just like you would in any social interaction. Maybe they have pictures on the wall of their family, or maybe they have some common hobby, or even if it's not a common hobby, it's a hobby that they're excited about. So you say, oh, I see you do such and such. Try to break the ice with something and just to get things going socially a little bit. discuss the ground rules. Are you going to use a tape recorder or not? You have to get approval for that, often written approval in the United States. It depends on your Institutional Review Board application. Tell them how you're going to use the information. Get us any signatures you need for informed consent. And you have to make clear the ground rules. So even among reporters who do this all the time, there's sometimes confusion about the ground rules, right? In Washington, there's a whole state of the art of different kinds of ground rules. On the record means I can quote you by name. On background means I could say, a senior State Department official, but I can't quote you by name. And on deep background means I can't mention even your organization or anything that might remotely identify you. And even though we have all these gradations, and those three are fairly commonly understood, sometimes people get into trouble when the rules aren't clearly articulated. So, for example, there's a reporter who was who was working for the Clinton campaign, and she gave an interview in which she called, not the Clinton campaign, the Obama campaign. She called Hillary Clinton a monster, was her quote. And then that was quoted in the article, and she felt that she had been talking on background, and so she was appalled at getting quoted directly. And in fact, she later ended up working directly for Hillary Clinton. So somehow they patched that up. But I'm sure it was a little bit awkward at that first meeting. So sometimes even reporters get unclear or mixed up about what the ground rules are. So you want to be very clear and get signatures where they're needed. As I said, I think if you can use a tape recorder, that's enormously helpful. It might inhibit some people. So, if you can sense they're nervous, but they might allow it, then you still have to worry that might be inhibiting them, and you have to make a choice then. Is it better that I put them more at ease and not record them, but have to take notes? Or is it better to record them even if they may be not quite as forthcoming since they know they're being taped? You'll have to make a judgment call on that, right? So often you can start with some easy, short, factual questions. When did you start this job? When did you move to this city? Whatever it is. And then move on to some more ambitious questions. You got to take in quickly the sort of culture of the interview. Sometimes people want to run the interview themselves and get out what they want to get out because they know your general topic and they know what they want to say. And other times they want you or expect you to take the lead in doing questions. And it can be difficult if they want to run the interview, but they want to run it in a different direction than you want to run it. And depending on their status and whatever else, it can be awkward to try to break in and interrupt and so on. So you have to be ready for those kinds of dynamics. And there may be all kinds of social dynamics going on depending on your and their, profession, age, whatever, right? So try to be aware of those things as much as you can in advance. Also think about how your demographic attributes, gender, age, education, language, accent, whatever else, are going to affect the nature of the interview, right? If they will. And sometimes, like if you were doing something on, let's say, civil and ethnic conflict, and you were from a country that these people perceived as having backed one side in the conflict, well, that's going to affect, perhaps the interview. And so do you need to get somebody else as an intermediary to do those interviews? Or if, again, let's say you're studying gender issues, how is your gender going to affect the nature of the interview? It's not that you're going to change your gender for your research, probably, but do you need to get, again, an intermediary or somebody else of a gender that will kind of be more likely to get frank answers about the questions that you want to ask? I don't know, but you have to think about those things. So at the interview itself, like I said, you have to be sometimes ready to interrupt, but you have to sort of play it by ear. Let me give you an example from one of my favorite interviews, the most interesting interview I'd say I've done. I'm doing a study on the intervention in Iraq in 2003, and I'm looking at the question why some people, politicians, academics, members of the administration, whoever, changed their minds. And first they thought it was a good idea to invade Iraq, and they advocated for that publicly. And then later on they changed their minds and said that was a mistake, and others didn't. So one of the people I was interviewing is a man named Walter Jones, who has since passed away. He was a member of Congress. And he was somebody who was so supportive of the intervention of Iraq that when France did not support the U.S. on the UN Security Council to intervene in Iraq, he wanted to change the name of fried potatoes in the cafeteria in the U.S. Senate to Freedom Fries instead of French fries, right? So if you heard of that, this is Mr. Freedom Fries, right? So I happen to know that he was a huge vocal supporter of invading Iraq. But I also knew that he had changed his mind and decided it was a terrible decision. So I wanted to start off open-ended, just ask him, why did you change your mind? And we were scheduled for about an hour interview, and his answer to that first question took about 20 minutes. And so I'm nervously looking at my watch and thinking, I got to get on to my other questions, but this is really fascinating stuff, and I don't want to prejudge, how he thinks he changed his mind, and I don't want to push him in this direction or that. But I want to get to my questions. In the end, he was very generous and gave me an hour and a half of his time. And the story he told was quite interesting. It was different from what I expected. It wasn't that he read a study or visited Iraq and saw how things were going badly or whatever else. He had gone to a funeral of a member of his congressional district who had been killed in Iraq as serving as a soldier. And at the funeral was the deceased person's wife, and their child was running around. And Walter Jones just sort of had this emotional epiphany that he had done the wrong thing, right? And of course, at this point, I'm trying not to shout. Don't if you vote for a war, people are going to kill and get killed. But don't argue with your interviewee. Don't shout at them. So I'm waiting. I'm taking this in and understanding that this was actually a very kind of almost intuitive, emotional decision rather than a information-driven decision. But I'm also trying to figure out, how am I going to get to the rest of my questions in the time that I have. So that was, both fascinating and nerve-wracking to sort of get everything I could in that interview. And I wish I'd interviewed him again before he passed away, but I may actually follow up with other people who knew him. So listen for those unanticipated leads and be ready to follow them up. Don't stick to your script of your question. So here I followed up trying to understand, how did he come to that decision? And I learned all sorts of other things about how he later pushed with a lot of people to try to change course in Iraq. Don't be afraid to ask questions that are seemingly naive, because sometimes those turn out to be profound questions. I mean, you don't want to ask a question that suggests you haven't done your homework, but sometimes, even if somebody has asked a question before, you might have a little twist on it that seemingly is simple at the first, but then actually gets to the information you want to get to. You have to decide how much you're going to preview the topics in the questions. Sometimes elites will ask, give me a list of the questions beforehand. Do you want to do that? Well, you want to give them some idea of your project, but sometimes giving them too much of an idea, maybe kind of leading the witness, and you don't want to do that too much. You could say, let's do the interview first, and then I'll give you a general idea of what to expect in that. But then if you have questions afterwards, I'm happy to spend more time, explaining my project to you. But you'll have to decide how you're going to balance that, how much you want to tell them in advance, and how much you want to sort of hold back until you've done the interview. Another key move in an interview, and this works especially well if you have a dog, is to do this. This is a great dog move. And that move and just being silent, you can't prick up your ears the same way a dog can, but that move is like, without saying anything, it's like, that's really interesting. Tell me something more, and wait for them, right? Don't just launch on to the next question, right? So, think of some ways to elicit more information, including body language. Using a translator, you may have to use a translator if you don't have the languages, but you have to train them. Yet they have to know as much about their project as your project as they need to. But you also don't want them thinking of themselves as being the researcher. They're working for you. Now they may have to explain to you, here's my list of questions. They may have to say, well, you can't ask that in this cultural context. You have to phrase it a different way. Be very attentive to that, right? But in the end, it's your research project, right? Don't let them go off in some other direction that you didn't want them to go. And so And also think about how their demographics are going to affect the interview. Like if I was interviewing about civil and ethnic conflict in Afghanistan, and I got a translator who had a Dari dialect, and they were talking, even if they had Pashto and they were talking to Pashtuns, they might get a different reaction because of the history, of clashes between different ethnic groups and different linguistic groups in Afghanistan. So be aware of that. How are the demographics of the translator going to affect the kind of answers that you're going to get? Okay, how do we handle difficult interviews? Maybe somebody's being unforthcoming. You have to think about, why are they not being more straightforward with me? What is it they're worried about, and how can I address whatever that is, right? So maybe they're worried about classified or proprietary information. How can you reassure them about that? How can you skirt around those issues? Maybe they're worried about their professional reputation or their social relations with other people, depending on the answers that might come out from the interview. Maybe they're worried about their political standing. Maybe if you won't come out till after the next election, that will put them at ease. Maybe they're worried about legal liability for things they might say to you. So how do you address that? They might be trying to be politically correct and tell you the politically correct answer. That can be difficult to get around. They may worry that you're going to misquote them, quote them out of context, misrepresent them, that somehow you're out to make them look bad. You need to be able to reassure them about that. And they may just be forgetful, right? Maybe they're not trying to mislead you, but our minds, are imperfect in recalling events. And you may have to prompt them with, oh, well, here was this document, or here's this news report, or here's what somebody else I talked to said. Now you have to be careful in revealing information from previous interviews, because maybe that was supposed to be anonymous, and they might say, well, who said that? So again, be careful about that. But you may have to prompt them in various ways to get a more accurate recall of what's going on. And documents can be one of the best ways to do that, because they may be contemporaneous, and then you're not relying on somebody else's memory. So you don't want to argue with the interviewee. There are ways to soften questions. You can say, some people have said that. It's not that I said that, or I'm accusing you of this thing, but some people have said that. I'll give you some more ways to handle tough questions. So how wide and open-ended are you going to make your questions? How narrow your topics and questions? It depends on your research project. Are you going to just try to get data and facts, things that can be corroborated by documents or other things? Are you going to ask TikTok questions? Get the timeline, who said what to whom, when, for what purpose, with what effect. You might ask about the sort of power hierarchy, both the formal organizational chart and the informal chart of how things actually work in the organization, and what are the differences between those two. You might ask what were their own opinions and policy preferences. I know this was the decision of the group or the company or the country, but what was your own feeling? Which side were you on in the debate about that choice, right? What were your own opinions? What did you feel? Were you upset at this decision, happy, relieved, angry? How did you feel? You might ask them about that. You might distinguish between their direct personal knowledge of events and things that they heard or learned secondhand. Courts make a distinction between these different kinds of evidence, and often we should too. Okay, when it comes to sensitive topics, there are ways to frame questions that are not going to trigger people so much. You could say, some people might wonder why, or how would you convince a critic that, or the media have reported this, or this is something I have to ask, right? Now, if they know there's going to be something sensitive in the interview, they probably expected that, and they probably want to get out their side of it, right? So, hopefully you don't have to worry too much that they'll get upset and end the interview. But in some sense, they may even want you to ask the difficult things so they can get their side out. But you might also, if you're at all worried that they might just cut off the interview and say, that's over, I'm not talking to you anymore, well, save that question for the end so you've got all the other information from the other questions that lead up to that one. Okay, so here are some questions that's almost always useful to ask for a lot of different projects. Is there anything I didn't ask that you expected me to ask, or that is important to understand these events, to understand what happened and why it happened? Who else should I interview? That's useful, but that can lead to what we call a snowball sample, where you're only interviewing one, insider group. But you can also ask, who were some of the people who disagreed with you in a smart way or in a stupid way or whatever? Who were some people that had a different view from you? Who were some people in different organizations or outside the government or outside your organization that didn't always agree with you, but might be informative, at least on their own views on this process? So that can help you get a little bit beyond the snowball sample. You might say, what were some unintended consequences of the choices that you made, either good or bad, right? What were some things that surprised you about the outcome? What were some of the motives behind those choices that led to unintended consequences? What are some common misunderstandings of these events that you see in the media or in people's memoirs or whatever sources? What are the questions you get all the time that are kind of misguided from either just people on the street or whatever else, right? What does the academic literature get wrong about this topic if the person knows anything about the academic literature? What documents can you share with me? There may be things that are, sort of internal documents, but they're not classified or proprietary. What published documents, books, articles should I be reading? Now, you would have done a lot of that anyway, and hopefully most of the things they mentioned you've already read, but there may be some things they point you to that you weren't aware of or that you hadn't read yet. Okay, so that's some advice about interviewing. As an exercise, if you're taking a class with me, let me ask that you go to the Google Doc, and if you're planning to do interviews, tell me about the kind of people you're planning to interview, whether by positions or attributes or whatever else. You may have specific individuals, but maybe just you have ideas about the kind of individuals you want to interview. How are you going to select them? How are you going to get beyond snowball sampling and find people who left the organization or people who opposed this group that you're talking to, excuse me, or had a different view on it, or were in competition with this group if it's a business or whatever? Are you going to interview some of those kinds of people? And what kind of challenges do you anticipate in your interviews, or what things are you worried about getting to and carrying out your interviews and interpreting the information that you get? So if you're planning interviews, take a few minutes and write some of that stuff up in the Google Doc.